Hi, I am Don Blackwell. I am the Executive Director of the Gospel Broadcasting Network, and this is Truth on Wheels. Today, I have a guest with me, David B. Smith. David preaches outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, the North Hamilton Church of Christ, a great and a faithful church. If you're in that area, I would encourage you to visit with them, and I stop there every chance that I can get. We love those folks very much. David's been here before, and David does a great job, and I'm thankful that he is here with me again today.
It's good to be here.
I searched online to see what questions were most frequently asked concerning religion. Let me give you the top 10. One of them was, who created God? Number 2, why does God hate me? I thought that was very interesting. Number 3, why does God need so much praise? Number 4, does life have a purpose? Number 5, is Christianity true? Number 6, is there a God? Number 7, is Christianity too narrow? Number 8, is the Bible reliable? And number 9, can I know God personally? In fact, all of these might be a good series for us to do, but the number one and the most asked question was this: why does God allow suffering?
Sure.
It's not an easy question.
No. I'm glad people are asking it. I think people are always sensitive, and I deep think things like you do sometimes, and I just think we are built, all of us, with a connection to God. And even if people reject God, which we've talked about in other shows, and they reject the knowledge of God, still deep down inside, there's this connection to God. And when things happen, you want to try to understand from that deep innate part that's built from us, God meant for us to have that, how that connects to God, because you're never going to be satisfied if you can't find out how all that works, because deep down, we all want to know where we came from and why we're here and where we're going. And now you've got to try to figure out how suffering fits into all of that. So it doesn't surprise me that people are asking that. And we've all asked that same thing before, I'm sure.
We did a previous program where we talked about the deity of Christ. I was actually surprised that was one of the most asked questions, but this one did not surprise me. In fact, the fact that it's number one did not surprise me. This is sometimes referred to as the problem of evil. And atheists will use this to deny the existence of God. In fact, I pulled up a few quotes. The philosopher David Hume actually made this argument. He was actually paraphrasing a Greek philosopher, Epicurus. But this is what he said: is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Now, this is sometimes called the Epicurean paradox. And basically what it says is you can't have both an all-powerful God and an evil world. They say that's a contradiction. He says, if such a God existed, he would logically have to prevent evil and suffering. And since evil does exist, then God does not exist. That's the argument that he makes.
And they have made that argument with great effect over the years. And you and I both, I'm sure, know personally people who have been adversely affected by circumstances of life, and they catch a little hint of that argument, and it makes a lot of sense in the moment, in their time of great suffering. And before you know it, they've just completely given up on God. So if not careful, if it's just viewed purely emotionally and you take the logic out of it, the reasoning that should stand behind it, it can be a really persuasive argument to pull people away from God. So it's been a very effective tool over the years.
And certainly not new. I mean, we look at this Greek philosopher Epicurus. This goes back since the beginning of time. People have struggled with this type of argument. I guess not the beginning of time. Adam and Eve, no, it goes way back. Let me give you another quote. This is from Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a well-known atheist. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. Let me read you this quote. He said, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, homophobic, racist, genocidal." He goes on and on. He calls us pestilence, sadomasochist, a malevolent bully, and he just goes on with this string of insults toward God. He argues then that these characteristics are inconsistent with the idea of a morally perfect being, therefore God does not exist. And we could give lots of these type quotes, but it is a very common argument. In fact, it is perhaps the most effective argument that atheists use to deny the existence of God, because everybody sees suffering.
I think so. And Dawkins particularly, because he's current, has used that book as sort of the blueprint for turning your back on God and abandoning the idea of God. He's been a very popular and a very effective atheist in that line of argumentation.
Yeah, in fact, if some folks are interested, several years ago, Kyle Buck from Apologetics Press actually debated Dawkins, and if you search on YouTube, you can see that debate.
Yes.
I actually was fortunate to be there and got to run one of the cameras that night, but that's probably been 20 years ago now.
I guess so.
It goes back. But all right, how do you explain this then? How do you explain the problem of evil in the world, suffering in the world, and yet God is all good? One explanation has been Calvinism. Calvinists believe that God is absolutely sovereign. Sovereign is kind of the key summary word of Calvinism. That means that he controls everything. That includes all events, all outcomes. They argue that nothing, including evil, happens outside of God's will. And so if a baby dies, God caused it. If there's murder, if there's rape, if there's theft, God is behind it. Why do I say that Calvinism is one explanation of this? How does Calvinism relate to this discussion?
Well, because Calvinism is a worldview. Every decision you make is filtered through a worldview, and your worldview becomes the way that you explain the stimuli, the circumstances in the world. So if you don't have a true biblical worldview, which Calvinism is not a biblical worldview, and that is your worldview, Calvinism, it's the way you filter everything. It's the way you understand biology and history and law and philosophy and theology. It's the way you understand everything. So now every single person in the world struggles. They have this dilemma where they want to try to figure out, how does suffering relate to my connection to God? And if Calvinism is your filter, it becomes the way that you perceive that. And unfortunately, I think you just explained it well. When you formulate and you latch onto a false doctrine, and Calvinism is that, if you try to be even slightly consistent with that false doctrine, you pigeonhole yourself in with these terrible consequential ideas, and that's what they've done to try to be consistent.
Yeah.
They've had to assume the position that every single thing that happens has been pre-manipulated by God. This is His choosing to do this in order to get around the implication, which would the opposite of that would be that man might actually have free will, and we can actually make a choice for ourselves. And that's what's happened with Calvinism.
It removes responsibility.
It takes responsibility out.
And so they say that every bad thing that happens, no matter how evil, it's part of His sovereignty. It's part of His purpose. And they'll say things like, they will say it doesn't mean He's the author of sin or evil, but rather He allows these things for His glory. And they'll say why He allows them, why He purposes them is mysterious to us. We can't figure out why God intends for these evil things to happen.
But they can deny that. The truth is, in their theology, they have to believe that He did author those things.
That's right.
Because if He is a master manipulator of every single situation in life, and it happens because of Him.
I completely agree with you. Of course, it's not the purpose of this program.
Right.
We reject the idea that God is the author of evil. We reject Calvinism. And if you want to further discuss that with us, reach out. We'd love to talk to you about Calvinism. But that is one solution or one explanation that is given, but we reject that.
We do.
So let's talk about what are the reasons for evil and pain and suffering and all the things that the atheists bring up to say it contradicts the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving God. What are some of the reasons that we have in this life for these bad things?
Well, maybe we should take a step back and justify God for just a moment. God never intended for suffering and evil to exist in this world. He never wanted that.
Yeah.
When we read the story in Genesis 3 where Satan comes on the scene and begins to tempt the woman, what he's calling her to do is to call in question, to dismiss authority as irrelevant.
Yeah.
And he draws attention to God, makes God look overly restrictive. And she initially responds okay when she says, God told us not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't look at it. Don't even touch it. And then he says, you're not going to die because God knows that in the day that you eat thereof, you're going to become like God. You're going to know good and evil. Yeah. Now, there's a partial truth there in when the devil said God's withheld something from you, he did withhold something. He withheld the experience of sin. He never wanted people to know that.
Right.
And God in his infinite knowledge knew that when sin entered the world, every catastrophic thing that we now experience in this world would come in along with it. And when they take of the fruit and they eat in verse 6 of Genesis 3, the whole world of suffering, that's what was ushered in because of that. God never wanted that for people. So it's completely unfair for people to say, God did this or God did that, or what about suffering? Because we want people to know this was never God's intention. He never intended this for humanity. Sin is the ultimate cause for every bit of suffering in the world. Now, does it have some benefits? And why does it do that? That's a different thing altogether. But God is just, and he never wanted this for people.
That's well said. And I think we could kind of summarize that in this statement. Why is there suffering and evil and these things? It relates to free will
100%.
And its consequences.
Yes, it is.
God granted human beings free will. That includes the freedom to make moral choices, even if that results in harm.
Yes.
The Lord loves us, and He didn't make us robots. He said you can choose, but there are consequences to your actions. Now, we live in a world that's filled with sorrow and suffering and pain. Why? It's because of us, not because of God. After my accident, for those who might not know, I'm a paraplegic. I am paralyzed from about here down. I flipped a four-wheeler several years ago. And since that time, I've lived with a lot of difficulties, pain, suffering, spent a lot of time in the hospital. After that accident, I frequently have had people say things to me like, well, it must be God's will. God must have done this for a reason. Well, that goes back to the Calvinist thinking that everything that happens is God's will,
right,
and that God orchestrated this. We have to understand that so much suffering in this world is a result of my own choices.
Mm-hmm.
I suffer the consequences of I don't believe the Lord flipped my four-wheeler. I believe I am a being who has free will. Honestly, I was probably driving too fast and being too reckless. And I remember one of the last thoughts I had before my accident was, I'm going too fast and being too reckless. I've got to slow down. That's the last thing I remember before I woke up in the hospital. It was a choice of my actions for which I was suffering. God didn't do this.
Sure.
God's not out flipping four-wheelers. Some suffering, a great deal of suffering, is my own sin. And in fact, you go back to the beginning, Adam and Eve ushered in suffering into this world because of the consequences of their actions. I think about sin and the suffering. Think about Cain murdering Abel.
Yeah.
Why did Abel suffer?
His brother was angry at God and took it out on him.
That was
in chapter 4.
That wasn't God's doing.
No.
That was a consequence of someone else's sin. I thought about the prodigal son.
Mm-hmm.
Why was the prodigal son suffering? That was his own actions. He made some choices. God allowed him to carry out those choices. Sometimes we suffer because of our own sin. Sometimes we suffer because of other people's sin. In fact, I made a list of some of these. Adam and Eve suffered because of their own sin. Think about the suffering that came because of the sin of David with Bathsheba.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you unfold that? All of the things that happened.
Yeah.
Not just David suffered, right?
Yeah, he murdered her husband.
You're right.
Indirectly, but yes, and the shattering of God's confidence in him, and the shame he felt. There were so many consequences that came from that. That was all by choice.
And his children, this just goes on in
generations
that suffered because of what he did.
Yes.
I thought about Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery in Genesis 37. He's suffering because of someone else's sin. Think about Matthew 2, Herod massacring the babies. Think about all the families that suffered. Why was that? It was because of someone else's sin.
Yeah, you mentioned the prodigal son. In that parable, it was the son who came to the father at the very beginning and demanded that he receive his inheritance.
Yeah.
The father didn't want that.
That's right.
The father grieved that, but he allowed him the choice. And it's just always been the case that you cannot have the capacity to love God unless you also have the capacity to not love him. And anytime you don't love God, there's consequences that come from that.
Yeah, I like the way you said that. When you think about this, why is there suffering? Number one, some suffering comes from my own sin, my own choices. Number two, some suffering comes from other people and their reactions. But number three, but sometimes I suffer because of things going on in the world. You know, there's a tornado that took place, and you might say innocent people suffered. I didn't do anything to be the result of a victim of a tornado or hurricane, or no one did that to me. How do you explain that? And I would point out that some suffering is a result of this fallen world, if you want to call it that. And it would go back to the consequences of Adam and Eve in the garden, right?
Of course, yeah. So Genesis 3, you've got the opening of the door of sin and all of the consequences that come from that. And, somebody says, well, why is it so hard to work? Or why is life so difficult? Well, there is a difficulty attached at the end of Genesis 3 to life as a consequence of sin. And then just a few chapters more, you get to chapter 6, and you've got the announcement about the flood. And when the flood happened, it changed geography and topography and climate, everything on the earth. And so you've got these weather patterns that didn't exist before. So when we point at things that are phenomenons of nature like a hurricane or a tornado, well, that's still ultimately because of sin. Yeah. Sin has terrible consequences. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. And again, it's not because God wanted it, but by the allowance of freedom of choice, people did make wrong choices, and we suffer the consequence of that today.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Genesis 3 and verse 16, the Lord says to Eve, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception in pain. You shall bring forth children. So when someone's suffering with the difficulties of childbearing, this goes back to sin. You think about Adam, and the Lord says, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth. And you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. What's he saying? The difficulties of labor and work. And you think about the thorns, and you go out and you get blisters and you cut yourself. And what does that go back to? It goes back to sin.
100%.
You mentioned Genesis chapter 6 and all the changes that took place as a result of the flood and this earth and the climate changes that occurred. What was that? Men were facing and thinking on evil continually. It goes back to sin. And so much, if you think of all the evil, pain, and suffering in this world, all of it traces back to the choices of man and sin.
That's right. 100%.
All right, let's talk about this. The greatest flaw that I think I see in the atheist argument, when they say that, because there is suffering, God doesn't exist. The greatest flaw I see is the idea that all suffering is bad, therefore God does not exist. Is it even a true statement that all suffering is bad?
Well, it's not a true statement. And who gets to decide that God is required to alleviate suffering? They make this argument and they say, God must take away suffering. Well, why must he do that?
Yeah.
And I've never heard a reasonable explanation as to why an atheist would demand that God take it away. Who are we to place that burden upon God to take it away?
Sure, we made the choice that introduced it in the world that brought these things. It's a consequence and a punishment. Now, as we're receiving punishment for our own actions, we're saying, well, the fact that we're being punished because of our actions proves that God doesn't exist.
Right.
And that's not logical.
No, it's not logical. And from cover to cover, the story of the Bible is how God can take really bad things and make them into really good things. So even with suffering, he can make something out of that.
I got to thinking about this when it comes to suffering. Very simple illustration. A child puts his hand on the stove and it hurts.
Sure.
He suffers and he has pain. And he pulls his hand away. Is that bad? Is that suffering bad?
The pain is bad, but it can be good.
Yeah.
From what he learns in that situation.
That's right. It actually could be a good thing. If my son does something wrong and I scold him, I punish him in some way. The idea of punishing is there's some sort of suffering, whether it be a spanking or depriving him of something. There's some sort of deprivation or punishment there. That's negative, but is it bad?
Yeah. I don't know a single parent who doesn't grieve that their children are experiencing whatever it might be that they're experiencing. But at the same time, it's happened by choice, and we can make something good out of it by what we're focusing and redirecting on. And that's what God does.
Yeah.
Suffering is not a terrible thing because of what benefits it can provide for us.
Yeah, that's right. So first point I wanted to make is when you say all suffering is bad, I don't even agree with that statement. Now, it's a consequence of sin, and that was bad. Mm-hmm. But when you look at suffering, there are actually some good things that strengthen us, that make us better in God's service.
Hebrews 12, he chastens the ones he loves, and he loves everybody, so he will allow bad things to happen. Of course, we choose to do those things, but he can allow it in such a way that it's actually going to make us better people.
That's right. One of those things would be our perspective on eternity. Suffering helps us distinguish between the temporary nature of earthly life and the promise of eternal life. I would say it this way. It helps us remember why we're here. Sometimes we might get so caught up with the idea that we're here just for this life. And if you're an atheist, that's why you're here. You are living for this life. And so if everything is not good and rosy, then, it just upsets everything. But this world helps us to remember when we see the difficulties and suffering, I remember that's not why I'm here.
That's right. I love the way in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul goes through some of those trials that he's been persecuted and pressed down. He's been through all of that, and he works his way to the end of that chapter and says this in verse 17 and 18, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment. So he's not dismissing the fact that there is affliction here upon the earth. Yeah. He said it's working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but those things which are not seen are eternal. So no writer of the Bible ever dismisses the fact that life's hard sometimes.
Right.
But those things work for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, which means something better is waiting for us when this life is over with. So it does change our perspective in a sense.
That's right. I want to read this quote. I've sometimes used this when I've talked about my accident, but I think it's very appropriate here. This was written by a sister in Christ, Jane McWhorter, after she'd had a very serious accident. She said, we are here. Why are we here? We are here to prepare ourselves for life after death. It doesn't matter whether we live 50 years or 100 years. Neither does it matter whether those years are carefree or filled with sorrow. The only consideration of lasting importance is where will we spend eternity? And the idea is that sometimes we get to thinking that happiness in this life, it's based on pleasure, it's based on everything going our way. And if anything disrupts that, then life is terrible, there's a problem, God must not exist, that sort of thing. We fall into the trap of thinking that's why we're here, to fix up our house and have vacations and to have fancy boats and to be entertained. And if anything upsets it or puts a ripple in our great, happy life, then we say, well, I'm miserable. We have to remember that's not why we're here. That's not what life is about. And when you see the difficulties in life, they bring that to our minds and our reality. John 9:4, Jesus said, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, for the night cometh when no man can work. That's why I'm here. Mm-hmm. The reason I exist is to bring glory to God and to serve him.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm just trying to connect back to something that you said earlier. Christians inadvertently become circumstantial Calvinists because as soon as there's suffering in this world, we say, why did God do this? As if somehow he orchestrated the suffering in my life.
That's right.
Instead of thinking, what's God got planned for me through this?
Yeah.
What's he going to do? How am I going to be better because of this? And like you said, with that perspective on eternity, but sometimes we abandon all of that when we go through suffering and we immediately want God to take it off as if somehow he put it on us in the first place.
That's right. I think Ecclesiastes 12:13 kind of summarizes this point. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole. The King James adds the word duty. This is the whole duty. I like it better without.
Oh, it's without.
Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole of man. What is man? What is life about? Fearing God and keep his commandments. That is the whole, the entirety of man. And sometimes along the way, these difficulties remind me of that. It's not about having a cush, easy, luxurious life. And when I see that, it brings to my mind, this world is not my home.
That's right.
I'm just a passing through.
That's Paul in Philippians 4, right? Where he says, I've learned how to be abased, and that's struggle. And I've learned how to ride the waves and be on top. And he says, and in whatever state I am, I've learned to be content. And then he adds, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, which is to say, as long as I have God, as long as Christ is in my life, I'm okay with whatever happens. And that ought to be our attitude, but it often isn't our attitude.
And in that same book, one of my favorite verses, Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So if I'm going to live, it's going to be Christ. There are going to be difficulties along the line, and yet that's not what it's about. That's why he says in Philippians 1:23, the King James says, I'm in a strait betwixt two. It's not how we talk, but I kind of like the way that sounds. He means I'm torn between two things. What are the two? He says to depart, to die, and be with the Lord, which is far better. What's the other thing? To remain is better for you.
Right.
What he's saying, I'm torn between two things. If I stay here, it's going to be hard. There are going to be difficulties. There's going to be suffering, but that's better for the church. But that's not really what I want to do. Now, what's his point? Sometimes dealing with the suffering, that's why we're here. That's our purpose. So to live is Christ. As long as I'm living, I'm going to deal with the suffering and the difficulties. That's why I'm here. But to die and be with the Lord, that's far better. This helps me keep my focus. I think that's what Paul's saying.
And his focus either way was on the Lord.
That's right.
Whether the Lord's body here or to be with the Lord somewhere else, it was the Lord. And that's what we've got to do to manage suffering correctly.
When it comes to suffering, another, if you want to call it a benefit, and I think it would fall into this category, is what I simply listed as character development. Are there certain character traits, certain attitudes, behaviors that are actually made better because of suffering?
Of course. Just thinking off the top of my head, I always think of James chapter 1, when he's talking about how when you have these bumps in the road, if you, instead of quitting, if you will go through them, they'll talk about how, your patience is made perfect as a result of that. And what he's saying is your character is refined through these. It's like a process where you're melting down precious metals and taking the dross off of the top, and you end up with pure metal at the end. So you go through these trying moments, whether it's the death of a loved one or you have physical setbacks in health or deteriorating condition, whatever it might be. And all of a sudden now you've learned to be patient, and you've learned how to be empathetic with people who also go through that same thing. And when people are grieved because they've lost loved ones, you now get it too. And all of a sudden now, your character is in a far better place than it was at the beginning of the suffering.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, if you think James 1 says the trying of your faith worketh patience in the King James, the idea is really endurance, perseverance. When you go through these things, it makes you stronger. It helps you to endure, resilience, humility, sympathy toward other people. These are things that come through suffering. We benefit, we're strengthened, we grow by these things. So I mentioned sympathy. Let's talk about that for a minute. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 15, the Bible says, weep with those who weep. I can personally say from my own life situation, suffering some things, it makes me more able to suffer with other people.
Sure.
Because I understand it differently. Things that I never understood. Just getting older makes you more able to weep with those who weep, doesn't it?
Sure. Yeah. When you have shared experiences in life, whatever the shared experience is, you always become more sympathetic to the people who are going through that. I haven't yet lost a parent. I've not done that, but I know folks that have. And in our congregation, when someone loses a mom or a dad, it's always those who have previously lost a mom and dad who immediately run because they know the pain that they're going through.
Yeah.
And to have fought and overcome cancer, or to lose somebody because of cancer, when someone gets that first diagnosis and they say, I'm looking at chemo or radiation, it's those people who run over to them and say, I've been through what you've been through. I know what you're experiencing. That's a big deal.
That's right. And just the older you get, the more experiences you have because you suffered. Because as we say, I've been there.
Right.
And once you've been there, you are more apt and more ready to be able to help other people.
100%.
So Romans 12:15, weep with those who weep. I'm better able to do that because I've suffered. I'm better able to serve and help other people. Galatians 5:22 says one of the fruits of the Spirit is kindness. And I always tell people when they hear fruits of the Spirit, sometimes people think mysterious things. Fruit is the word karpos. It just means the product of something.
That's right.
So if you follow the teachings of the Holy Spirit, which means the Bible, you follow the teachings of the Bible, there are certain products you will have in your life. What are they? Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, goodness, kindness, and gentleness. He lists these things. There are certain characteristics you'll have in your life if you practice the teachings of the Bible. I've heard people say sometimes, well, are you saying a non-believer could have the fruit of the Spirit? Yeah, if a non-believer follows the teachings of the Bible, they can have love in their life. They can have kindness. Can a non-believer practice kindness? Sure. Where are they going to learn godly care? Where are they going to learn about kindness? They're going to learn it in the Bible. So if they read the Bible and they see the teachings of the Holy Spirit and they practice good parenting, or they practice love, or they practice kindness, do they have a fruit of the Spirit in their life? Well, of course they do. But one of the things that I would argue would be this: when I go through these things and the suffering and the difficulties, it makes it easier for me to be kind to another person. Sure. When I see them hurting in the same way. And I say that only from my own personal experiences. I joke sometimes because it used to be that someone would pull out in front of me in traffic and I would say, why is that person driving so slow? But now when they pull out in front of me, I get to thinking, maybe that person has a wheelchair in the back. They're trying not to sling around like I did. It makes me look at things differently when you've been there. It kind of relates back to the sympathy point.
That's right.
What about humility? Is that a characteristic that gets developed in a person's life from suffering?
Yeah, I think we all have a Superman complex sometimes. We think we're impervious to the situations of life. And it's very humbling when you find out I am frail.
Yeah.
I'm just dust. I'm made of the dust of the earth, and I'm susceptible to these things. And I mentioned 2 Corinthians 4 earlier, back earlier when Paul says I was pressed down and I was perplexed, and he goes through all of that. He'll immediately follow by saying that it was all because Christ's power could be shown in me to mean I am not powerful to handle these situations, but the Lord is.
Yeah. And
I have to be reminded from time to time that I'm not the be all and end all of this life. The Lord is.
Yeah.
And I need Him to handle things for me. And so I need to be reminded of that. And suffering is a way to be reminded of that.
James 4:6 says, God resists the proud, but He gives grace to the humble.
Yes.
Sometimes being humbled helps me. I think about Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar's walking around his kingdom in the book of Daniel, and he says, look at this great kingdom that I have made. And of course, the Lord forcibly humbled him.
He did.
And after he crawled around on the ground like a cow for an extended period of time, he changed his tune.
He was a different man at the end of that story.
Completely different man. Humility and the things he suffered, from that standpoint, it was divine punishment, but miraculous divine punishment that I don't think it's taking place that way today.
Right.
But then that was occurring, but the humility changed him in a positive way.
Yeah.
There are ways in which we are refined spiritually by suffering, and I listed several of these. The first one I put down is, would you say that suffering teaches us to pray? Is that an accurate or a reasonable thing to say?
Yes, I think people remember to do it when they should have been doing it all along. But for sure, when we get a diagnosis or something, phone call, somebody says, hey, somebody's been in an accident. The first thing we do is we turn our attention upward to God. Should do that all the time.
Yeah.
But suffering really causes people to look up toward God. And of course, the way we communicate to God is through prayer. So yes, we are put in positions where we are reminded that prayer is absolutely necessary to a Christian's life, and suffering is one of those times.
Yeah, maybe saying it teaches us to pray is not the best, because we get instruction about prayer from the Bible. But It causes people, it brings people to turn to God when they're desperate.
And not just them, others. Pray for me. They'll ask other people in those moments to pray for themselves.
It's interesting that I remember after 9/11, when the country was bombed and attacked by terrorists,
Yes.
that the statement was made on a regular basis from even ungodly people, pray for our country at this time. It seemed to bring a change and an awakening with people when times are desperate. Sometimes even ungodly people want to turn to God for help. You know, as I said earlier, I don't think that the Lord flipped my four-wheeler.
Sure.
The Lord is not causing these bad things. Sometimes I've seen it where there'll be a situation where maybe a child dies because they're hit by a drunk driver. And then people will say, a well-meaning person will come to the funeral and say to the parents, well, God must have wanted your child in heaven. That wasn't God's doing.
No.
That wasn't God's will. It was a violation of God's will. Somebody sinned and violated God's will and got drunk, and they went out and they killed a child. And then somebody said, well, it must have been God's will. No wonder people get angry at God. I don't believe God caused that, but I do believe God can use negative event. I don't believe God flipped my four-wheeler, but I've thought oftentimes that I think that he's been able to use it in various ways. There have been doors that have been open, people that I can talk to who would not have necessarily listened to me in the past. After my accident, and we were remodeling my house to change the bathroom to accommodate me and so forth, we had 4 contractors working in the house. We were able to teach the gospel and baptize all 4 of these men.
Amazing.
I don't think that I would not had that opportunity. So I think the Lord providentially used it. He didn't cause it, but he can still open doors and use it in his providence. But I got to thinking about this, is getting off the subject just a little bit. But when I'm thinking about suffering teaching us to pray, sometimes people will say, well, I was praying and God didn't answer my prayer. Why doesn't God answer my prayer? And some people use that as another proof that God does not exist. And in the same vein, but I'll mention this very quickly because it came to my thinking. Honestly, it came to my thinking because after my accident and I was struggling and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed, Lord, please fix me. I put on Facebook asking people to please pray for me that I can walk again. And after months of suffering and dealing with these things, I wasn't getting any better. They did what they call the Asia test, where they stick you with needles and try to see if you're gaining anything. I wasn't gaining anything. And it just brought me low. It made me question prayer. And I really started digging in and studying this. And my conclusion was not that God doesn't answer prayer.
Right.
And it wasn't that God did this to me. It wasn't to blame God.
Right.
But it ended up making me stronger. And I thought about this in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 7. Paul said, unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of revelation. I think what he's saying, exalted above measure, I might get full of myself here. Why? The abundance of revelation. He had all sorts of miraculous abilities. Could that go to your head? Seems like what he's saying. A thorn in the flesh was given to me. I've heard people say, well, God gave him that thorn in the flesh. I don't think so, because the next verse says a messenger of Satan was given to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded the Lord 3 times that he might take it away. But the Lord said no. Why? He said, my grace is sufficient for you. The Lord didn't cause it, but the Lord didn't remove it. Why? Because it was actually in Paul's best interest that it not be removed. And that made such an impact on me when I studied 2 Corinthians chapter 12. So I know I'm digressing and getting off the subject.
That's great, though. That's really good what you said.
Here's another thing that comes from suffering. I made this point. Suffering purifies us. Do you think that's a valid statement?
I do think so.
Let me explain what I mean by that. What I mean is it makes us search ourselves. 2 Corinthians 13:5, examine yourselves, whether you're in the faith, test yourselves. Can suffering cause us to do that?
I do think that. Yeah. But That's when we are most honest with ourselves, I think. You mentioned something a moment ago that I think happens too often is we're very full of ourselves.
Yeah.
And all the layers are kind of pulled back in suffering. And we get to see ourselves as we really are.
Yeah.
And that's usually when we're honest with ourselves, is when we are totally exposed by suffering. And so in that sense, yeah, we are purified by it, in the sense that we get to actually really do something fundamentally that probably should have been done a long time ago with who we are as people.
I want to read two passages in connection with this, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on them. Psalm 119 and verse 67, David said that he went astray before he was afflicted. And then the second one is just a few verses later, Psalm 119 verse 71. He says, it's good for me that I've been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. I went astray before I was afflicted, and it's good for me that I've been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it is not a guarantee, because sometimes hearts are too hard. Yeah. And people sometimes are like those Hebrews 6 people. They're kind of a little too far gone.
Possible.
And they just can't really penetrate that heart and make it right. But I have known people, and I could name them, you can too, of people who were once faithful Christians who had fallen away, and they are brought low by doctor's visit, and doctor says, you've got terminal cancer, something's wrong, or a death in the family. And all of a sudden in that moment, they think, I need to be right with God. And they make amends in those moments. And so suffering has a very powerful, very persuasive effect on people to purge what's bad and start filling up on good things again.
Yeah, in fact, 2 Corinthians 13:5, I mentioned a moment ago when he says, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. I think sometimes people might think that that means whether you're in the faith. They take that to mean, well, whether you're a Christian. Well, this is written to Christians.
Right.
So what does he mean when he says to a Christian, examine yourselves whether you're in the faith? It means 1 John 1:7, are you walking in the light? Right. Test yourselves. I know after I had my accident, I woke up in the hospital and I didn't know how I got there. It went through my mind, what if I had woken up in eternity? And it made me search myself. And even though I was a Christian and a gospel preacher, I still search myself to think, is there anything amiss, anything that I need to take care of and fix in my life? And so suffering caused some good reflection.
It should all of us, regardless of the severity of the suffering.
Yeah.
Every crisis, every moment of suffering should be a constant reminder, this could have been me now standing before Jesus in judgment. If I'm not ready, I need to make changes. So the next time around, if it's catastrophic, I'm ready to go. I think that's a great point. All of us should be ready. And suffering has a unique way of reminding us of what's most important in life and whether or not we're ready.
And what if a person, just hypothetically, what if a person's involved in an accident and they almost die, but they make it? And then they're in the hospital and they're reflecting and they think, I got to get my life right with God. You know, I almost went to eternity lost. And as a result of that, they end up obeying the gospel. They get their life straightened out. Right. The question, was that suffering good or bad?
It was good.
I mean, you have to go back to David saying, it is good for me that I've been afflicted, right, that I might learn your statutes. I went astray before I was afflicted. And so I think that would be a modern day application.
I think so. I think it's a good application.
Let me mention just one more thing. Is it not true that suffering oftentimes can make us count our blessings? It makes us appreciative for the good things that we have.
Yes. And I would argue, not all suffering is bad. Sometimes you've got to go through that because especially in America, we are abundantly blessed with good health largely, and certainly monetarily. We live so affluently here in America. And it's not a bad thing to struggle or to suffer, to be reminded that we really are blessed, that God has blessed us, and that we should be doing a lot more with the blessings that He's given us. But I think that's a good thing. Too often it takes going through that before you realize how blessed you are.
I like your point. We're so affluent that we don't want anything bad to have. We want to have the lavish life. Mm-hmm. We want to have enjoyment constantly.
Yes.
I think we've raised a generation of people that we think life should be nothing but pleasure and entertainment 24/7. And if that doesn't happen, then there's something wrong with this picture. And suffering is good to make us stop and appreciate.
Yes, it is.
And we've got a serious problem with ingratitude in our country. Psalm 103 and verse 2 says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all of his blessings." We sing the song sometimes, "Count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done." That's just Psalm 102 and verse 30.
Of course, yes.
Count your blessings. It has made me stop. I just give you a very personal example here. Some days when I wake up, I think, nobody's got it worse than I do. I think about, I'm just woe unto me, and I count all the bad things. I'm paralyzed. I'm in pain. I can't do this. I've missed that. And then other times I get to thinking, what I still have. I can still work. I can still drive. I have to do it with my hands, but I can still drive. I had an occasion where I was able to teach a man who was also a paraplegic. He'd been shot. He had a bullet in his spinal cord, one in his arm, one in his neck. And as a result of that, he was a paraplegic, but he also did not have proper use of his hands. One day we were visiting, and he said, "Don, I just wish I were like you." And I said, "What do you mean you wish you were like me?" And he said, "You can use your hands." And he said, "You can transfer yourself from one seat to another. You can drive." And I went out of there thinking to myself, I can use my hands. It just made me stop and think about this other man's suffering and him bringing this to my attention. And it made me think how many days, I was 47 years old when I had my accident. So how many days I jumped up, threw my legs over the side, and I never stopped to think about it and didn't count that as a blessing. But now, almost every day, I think to myself, I can use my hands. How often do we stop and think about that as a blessing?
Rarely.
Yeah. And we could put so many things into that category that Psalm 103 and verse 2, bless the Lord and do not forget his blessings. We've got to stop. That's something the Lord expects us to do, is to have gratitude and appreciate. Sometimes in this rich, wealthy, like to use your word, affluent country, we forget to do that.
We do.
Yeah. I'll give one more point here, because this made me think about Numbers chapter 11. The children of Israel, the Lord had rescued them from slavery and bondage, and he had taken them into the wilderness, but it's part of the rescue. Numbers 11 and verse 4, they said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish that we freely ate in Egypt, and the cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlics. But now our whole being is dried up, and there is nothing to eat except this manna." So what they were saying is, we remember the fish, and man, those cucumbers and that garlic, oh, we miss that. All we have now is the manna. Where'd they get the manna?
From God.
Yeah. This is the blessing of God. Instead of stopping and thinking the fact that they're in the wilderness where there's not food and God is feeding them, instead they think, oh, this is so sorry. God's giving them food when there's no food. Instead of counting their blessings, what they're doing is they're counting their bruises. One thing that I've learned, whenever I stop counting my bruises and count my blessings, it changes my feelings.
And look at what they had been through. God delivered them miraculously from Egypt. And every time they complained, out of his graciousness, he provided for them. He constantly, continually did that. And if I read the Bible correctly, I think I am, and I think you know it too, manna was pretty good tasting stuff.
Yeah.
And you had the quail. So God was making rich provisions for the people, and yet they constantly complain. And I think we do that with our blessings. We discount them, we take them for granted until they're taken away. Yeah. And then we want them back when we should have been grateful to begin with them.
Yeah, that's right. I'll give you an illustration and we'll wrap up. We're already getting long, but I heard an illustration about this lady. She had a knock on her door one day. She answered the door. It was Miss Smith. She had brought her a pie. And she said, "Is that for me? Thank you so much. I appreciate it." She just went on and on gushing about the pie. The next week, she brought her another pie. And she said, "Thank you for the pie." The next week, she brought it and she tasted it. She said, "You need a little more sugar in the pie." Well, The fourth week, she saw her passing by, but she didn't have a pie, and she stuck her head out the window and she said, "Hey, where's my pie?" And the point related to how when we are richly blessed, we get to the point that we take it for granted, and we expect it, and we get to the point that we don't appreciate it. And I think that we need big doses of that in America, and it's a benefit that comes from this. It makes me stop and count my blessings.
Yeah, good. It's just a reminder that God will not personally orchestrate our suffering, but he lets it happen for beneficial reasons, for our benefit, to be reminded of what we've already enjoyed from him and what greater things could be. Suffering's not altogether bad.
That's right. If I were going to summarize the whole program, I would say, why is there evil, pain, and suffering? It's because God gave us freedom of choice. That's right. We made decisions that brought evil and pain and suffering into this world. It's forever changed the world. We suffer because of a changed world that goes back to sin. We suffer because of our own actions and sin. We suffer because of other people's actions and sin, but it all goes back to man, not to God. But even still, as we're seeing, there's some good and some positive things that come from suffering.
That's exactly right.
Well, thank you, David. I appreciate you,
brother.
Always good to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Truth on Wheels. If you have any questions, send us a message at info@gbntv.org. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, be faithful.